Alrighty,
Okay.
here we go.
Yes.
And this evening's topic is
How to have better conversations with someone that you disagree with. Yes.
I should laugh.
Yes. So I guess kind of as a first lens is when there's a disagreement, emotions are already running high. So how do you go into it feeling calm? Like, what are some preparations and what are some ways to regulate emotions beforehand, especially because this is disagreement?
I think the first thing that all of us have to learn and learn better and remember when it comes up is that disagreement isn't conflict. So it can certainly quickly turn into it, but it's not. We can disagree all day long, all our lives long, and still be in peaceful relationship with each other. So I think part of what happens with disagreement, including deep disagreements, doesn't matter what level of disagreement, but part of what happens is that as soon as people disagree, they think they're in conflict, and so then they generate that. And then when you were talking about feelings escalating and so on, people being hot, that's what's happening. But they didn't have to go there. So we need disagreement. We need difference of opinion. That's how we get to our best answers and decisions and ideas for things. And if we can learn to not be frightened of disagreeing, and then to recognize that disagreeing doesn't mean disagreeing on one even very important thing doesn't mean we don't necessarily align on other things. I think that can be very preventive. And then, of course, if things do escalate from disagreement into conflict, then determining through a resolution process, the finding of common ground is what will help you there. But once people disagree, particularly about the things that are dearest to them, so personal values obviously rank highest in that regard. And particularly if there are only two people or two groups, polarization happens very quickly and easily. And that's the greatest danger, really, in conflict. It removes us from the substance of the real, if there's a real initial conflict. It's the source of mob mentality. It's the kind of thing that can escalate. When we see group things escalating into violence, that's a lot of what's happened. And we need to break polarization, certainly. That's a big, big deal. And there's an inclination in people individually and also more largely in cultures. There's an inclination to polarization. And the quickest, easiest way to break any cycle of polarization or prevent it in the first place is to not allow for two things to be involved in anything. Just the injection of a third voice. So when you're in disagreement, even just drawing in a third voice, or many more, but certainly in the most basic of terms, drawing in a third voice can break that cycle. Because the habit is we disagree, there are two of us, we go back and forth. As we go back and forth, the polarization is us getting further and further apart. When you bring in a third voice, it breaks that momentum of pulling further and further apart. And so it can bring people back together and prevent conflict from fully escalating or rising. And if there is a conflict simmering, it can bring down the temperature, cool things out, and people can get into further discussing things peacefully. So polarization is the biggest danger. And one of the easiest tools for that is at least a third voice. And that could be a neutral voice that you call in, or it could be another voice, an equally invested, direct stakeholder, equal stakeholder, other voice, but just that third voice can be very helpful in that. But really it gets back to the beginning of keeping in mind, really getting clear and comfortable with disagreement not being conflict by definition. It's not the case.
And I like that you brought up polarization, because I think that a key to polarization, especially as we see it in the media right now, is that someone may value the same thing, they may have that same core value, but they target it at different fronts. So say like the media is targeting like family as a core value and saying that one side doesn't respect family as a core value, when in reality they may also have family as a core value, but there's just this outer voice telling another person, these values are not common, when in reality they are. Like, how do you combat it when there is such stark polarization, especially in the media, and you're going into conversations with people and they've been influenced by media?
Media is intended to serve us. If we think about the news, so people who gather and narrate the news, that's intended to be a service to us. And it, obviously we recognize that that's gotten at times perhaps wildly out of control. But we have to remember that even well-intended, even well-balanced media is also a source of that groupthink, a generator, right, of groupthink, for better and worse, of groupthink and group action. So you have to be mindful of that as a consumer of it, right? And remember yourself to seek. So if we get back to polarization and adding in at least a third voice, seek those voices, right? Seek a third voice, seek more than two, and seek specificity. So as you were saying, people will say this group of people doesn't value family, doesn't have any family values. And we know it's not the case, of course, but maybe they talk about it in different ways, or they focus on different aspects of it. And that's very much true for every person in every aspect of their personal values. That we use a lot of broad strokes when we talk about things like values, and values are a huge influencer of conflict, a huge generator of conflict. But when we talk about those, we use these broad strokes like family values or work ethic. There are a lot of things that are actually quite general or quite vague, and we need to get specific and clear ourselves on what does it mean for me to say that family is really important to me? What does that mean? What does that look like in my life? How do I show up for those values? And what does that indicate about truly the specificity of my values? And what does that look like for someone else? And the more specific we get about those things, that's where we start to find the common ground, right? If I can say I come up with 11 ways that family is really important to me, and it's important to me to show up with them and engage with family and so on. Let's say I just made a list and it came out to 11, and someone else who seemed the polar opposite of me did the same. I'm sure at least some of those would be aligned, at least some of them. And that's the big surprise, when people will engage in managing their differences and managing anything that escalates into actual conflict. When they're willing to engage in the discussions of that, it's inevitable that you find common ground. It's absolutely inevitable. So that would be a promise I would make. If you are willing to go the distance and dig, you will find common ground. Because what's that statement? We are more alike than we are unalike.
Yes.
And that includes in our needs, in our challenges, in our deepest values. We are more alike than we are unalike. So when we find the differences, instead of allowing them to become polarized and ourselves to become polarized in that and conversing about them, if we can begin to ask each other with genuine curiosity, right? Questions of, what does that look like for you? I don't think we're that different. Can we talk about it more? And what does that look like for you? Instead of, no, I heard this about you, or I've seen you do this, or I've seen you not show up for this, or whatever. Instead of that, asking questions that engage and draw someone out, and draw out, because maybe they've never thought about what their values really mean. They're used to, because of the larger community and even larger conversations we have as we grow up and carry on our lives. They're used to speaking out certain things, but maybe they haven't spent a lot of time thinking about it. And so you can have that conversation instead of having the back and forth, just beginning to batter each other.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Definitely, I agree. Like more specificity. Did I say that right?
Specificity.
Specificity.
It's a tough one. That's
yes.
a tongue twister. Specificity.
Specificity.
Yeah.
Yes. And often I find that some disagreements are just a lack of information on the other side.
Oh, yes. Well said.
Just a lack of information.
Definitely a lack of information.
Mm-hmm. So I think the next thing that, as you're talking, what got brought up to me is, how do we go about these conversations with, say, a friend versus a family member versus a stranger? Because often family, you find that possibly you have some very similar core values. Friend, possibly as well. Stranger, you don't know so much. Maybe you may not share core values with a stranger.
Yeah.
And so how do you go about those conversations with those different groups of
If
people?
a seeming disagreement arises, you mean? From my perspective, it's pretty much the same, no matter who. And the only distinctions, one distinction would be formality. So the level of formality, the level of naming things that you need to discuss, the level of naming steps in a process you might need to go through to come to some understanding. So formality around that. So certainly at work, if we were dealing with a formal, massive disagreement that either had escalated already or could easily escalate into something with damaging effects, we would address that more formally and more officially, and also more formally in the way we talked about it. You're not going to do that at home. If you're sitting down and having one of these discussions and trying to find peace with a family member, you're not going to say, so about that process that we need to get into, but you still bring it, right? So you still bring all the elements of it. So you still bring the elements of practicing asking thoughtful questions, right? Recognizing that you are in ignorance, no matter how long you have known someone. When you come across, especially if you're blindsided, if you're surprised by a difference between you, there's ignorance there. You have some ignorance, or you wouldn't have been surprised by it. So the best way to get past that is to begin to ask thoughtful questions and to be plain about your intentions. How often do I say this? Be plain about your intentions. It's obvious that we're disagreeing about this. It's obvious that it's important to both of us. It's also important to me that we be able to disagree peacefully, and that we come to a better understanding of what that thing is that we're disagreeing on, and see just how far apart we are, or in what ways we're actually far apart, and in what ways we may be a lot closer than we could imagine right now. Right? So can we have that conversation where we ask thoughtful questions, where we obviously conduct ourselves in ways where we're managing our feelings the best we can, and if there arise moments where we can't, then we just take breaks, because it's okay. It's okay to not be able to manage your feelings, but we want to make sure that we're not really escalating and adding momentum to a disagreement becoming a conflict.
Yes. Yes. And so, what do you think a productive conversation looks like at the end? Is it a decision made of how to go forward? Is it like, what do you think are different avenues of how you can see success after a conversation?
Well, if a conversation comes to its natural end, but you haven't found understanding, if you're in disagreement, not yet in conflict, or you haven't found resolution, if you're already in conflict, but you've made progress, then the best end, the most productive end, is to recap, right? Acknowledge okay, look where we started, and look where we are now. We haven't resolved this yet, or we haven't come to a full understanding yet, but we've made progress. That's good, and it takes a lot of energy. So it's taken a lot of energy. So let's take a break. Let's revisit this. Can we come back and talk about it more, and make sure there's that willingness of anyone who's involved. You're talking about polarized situations, so that'd be two people or two groups that are involved. So, make plans. If you can make specific plans to talk again, that'd be great. But definitely ending it, especially when it's more personal, definitely ending it on the acknowledging where we're at, what we've come to, with the effort that we put in, and acknowledging the effort and being appreciative of the other person's effort, and appreciative of yourself for that matter. But so that would be, if you're not at full understanding or you're not at full resolution, that would be the thing. It would be about asking for a next step, if you feel comfortable doing that. Or you can let things sit. You can just let things sit, and you can say, this is part of the acknowledgement practice. You could say, I'm available to talk about this more. I'm really glad we did this, even if it was really difficult, even if it still seems murky. I'm really glad we did this, and I'm here if you want to talk about it more. And then if they're willing, they're already willing, then definitely make a plan to talk about it more.
Do you think that, say, after a difficult conversation about disagreement is had, if it in the future is never really brought up again, or it's kind of this thing that you've now shoved under the rug and you don't really talk about it again, it's an unspoken thing that you just don't really do anything about this from now on because you had that conversation, and maybe it went somewhere, you acknowledged each other at the end, but now you're not really talking about it anymore, it's never been talked about again. Do you see that as successful, or can it be successful, or do you always see that there's always going to be an underlying tension?
I think there's incredible danger in just the fact that you use the language of sweeping it under the rug, right, implies to me that there's something that needed to be addressed that was in fact swept under the rug. So that's dangerous. It's just risky. It's more like, unless you have thoughtfully discerned that something really doesn't need any further attention, and that happens too. There are lots of things that happen on a daily basis in our lives that are like that. But unless that's the case, if you acknowledged with someone and had a conversation, acknowledged there was something of significance and it needed attention, and you make a little progress and then you just leave it, it is more likely to rear its ugly head later than not, And even if it explicitly itself doesn't rear its ugly head, it will have influence on other things. So it could trigger other negative things, and it can just erode the relationship at hand in other ways if it's not addressed. So it's definitely not about navel gazing, and it's not about having to talk through everything, the minutiae of life with everyone and make sure we understand each other perfectly. That's not it. In fact, you don't need full understanding to resolve something genuinely. You don't. It's important to aspire to some clarity of understanding, but you actually can genuinely resolve something and not have it affect you again without that. So, and life is too short to be wrapped up in too much of the minutia, whatever, trivial things. And there are things that we get upset about that are in fact trivial when we think about them. So it's important to pay some attention there. But sweeping things under the rug, all this language we have for that kind of action, mental action, it has force, it has influence. So I would be nervous. I would do your best to revisit and continue to a place where you feel comfortable in your understanding with each other, and you really feel like we've dealt with that and we can move forward in whatever other ways we want to move forward.
And I know we've talked about ways to ease the tension in the room as you are gathering to talk about something. We've talked a lot about this recently, but yeah, could you just share what you think the best ways are to ease the tension in a hard conversation, especially with people who you are very comfortable with, but this sort of conversation's hard, you know? What are some tools?
You mean how to set up the environment kind of thing?
Yes.
So we talk about when we're thinking about sitting down with people. So you talk about being in the room, doesn't matter where you are. You could be on the beach instead of in a room. But when you're sitting down to talk with people, you want to make sure that people are physically comfortable. So there's there's all the mental preparation, but in terms of the environment, you want to make sure that people are physically comfortable. So even I love the example that the opposite of this, the example of police detectives interrogating people and doing their best to make sure the environment is very uncomfortable. At least this is what we see on television, right? So they make the room really cold. They give someone lots to drink and don't offer them a restroom break, and that kind of stuff. So we want to do the opposite of those TV detectives. We want to make sure that people can be physically comfortable so that they can relax. So physiologically they're calm, so that we can have our best chance of having calm, clarifying conversations. So that environment is a really important way to address or prevent tension. Right? We are bringing down the physical, bringing down to calm all the physical influences and elements, and making sure that that's working for everybody. So that's one way. Certainly, the same tools, being plain about your intentions, reminding people of that. So reminding people of that when the conversation gets hard, but also when it's easy. So when things are going well, really pointing out regularly, look how well we're doing. Look how well we're doing. And those are like quick wins or small wins, right? So it helps people to continue with the positive, constructive attitude.
Yeah. Hey, do you have anything else that this conversation makes you think of?
Not at the moment.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay, that's enough.
Okay.